I'm happy to introduce our two speakers, Kleiner and Vicentinos, who will engage in a friendly dispute on the treatises of Lusitano and Vicentino. Kleiner studied harpsichord and continuo here at the Scuola Cantorum Baseliensis. He's co-founder of Ensemble Il Profondo and the duo L'Istante, and works regularly as assistant in opera productions across Europe. His research focuses on chromatic and harmonic instruments and music of the 16th and 17th centuries. This has also led beyond the borders of early music to cooperations with contemporary composers, such as Caspar Johannes Walter. With the research project Studio 31, he reconstructed an organ with 36 and a harpsichord with 31 keys per octave. And he is now a member of Martin Kirnbauer's SNF project, Vicentino 21. Sorry, my numbers are in German, apparently. And he is writing his dissertation on Vicentino as well. Johannes teaches tuning and temperaments here at the Scuola and is guest docent at the Universidad Central de Bogotá for continual performance practice and chamber music. Vicentinos studied at The Hague, the Conservatorium from Amsterdam and ESMUC, and is a musician, recorder, player, and artistic researcher. He's the director of Morispano, and he holds the chair of recorder at the Superior Conservatory of Music in Sevilla. Vicente is currently a Research Foundation Flanders Doctoral Fellow at the University of Leuven and Doc Artes Orpheus Institute in Ghent, focusing on historical improvisation, and his doctoral research project intends to revive the lost Renaissance musical practice of improvised counterpoint, with a central focus on Lusitano's manuscript treatise. So this is a battle of the doctoral candidates. Writing the unwritable, a comparison of Lusitano's and Vicentino's treatises. Welcome Johannes, Vicente, and David Gallagher, who will be moderating their discussion.
I think I'm here to stop them fighting. And at the end you need to decide which one of them wins the gold schooling. It's interesting that two treatises that are so very different by two opponents in many ways should have so many things in common, and that's what we're here to talk about today. And one really crucial thing they have in common, and one of the reasons why we're very, very lucky to have these treatises, is because they both document a musical practice that is not otherwise documented in anything like the same detail, or even at all, at around the same time, and yet we know that other musicians will be using these practices as well. So it's a really happy accident that we have both of these treatises. Could you tell us, each of you, what are these specific practices that Vicentino and Lusitano expressed in their treatises, and the ways in which they're different from mainstream 16th century practice?
Well, first, you decided, no. No. Well, first thing is, there's no money involved today here. Speaking of Lusitano's treatise, what it documents is just mostly counterpoint techniques that were quite universal. They were common knowledge to practitioners, to musicians, to performers, but they were also common knowledge, probably a very important part of the training of composers. So there's multiple use cases for this technique or this knowledge, which is basically from creating music on the spot, something which was very much in need, especially in relation to liturgy and the necessity to create different sounding versions of very well-known plain chants, for instance. But it was also the main technique, of course, for composers, for composing music. And it was, the way I like to look at it is like a very fluid tool in the sense that you definitely have to learn it regardless what your main task would be afterwards. whether you would be a composer, you would need technique, whether you would be a singer who needs to add new counterpoint in every performance during liturgy, for instance, but also if you were an instrumentalist, because we know there is archival evidence in Iberian sources, which are quite rich in this sense, of minstrels, ministrillers being asked to also perform extemporary counterpoint during the liturgy.
In Vicentino's case, he clearly talks about written counterpoint. His main goal is polyphony. And he's quite critical about the improvised technique. What I see different in his approach to what I consider mainstream 16th century counterpoint teaching is that he doesn't transmit the principles of polyphony or counterpoint by restrictive rules, so you shall not do this and you cannot do that, but by encouraging things, following certain principles. So it's much more about the generation of music, production of music, than the assessment of the value of music or the correctness of music. It's impossible to say something is correct or incorrect following Vicentino's principles, but you can produce easily music that behaves within certain borders. And one of those principles, just to give a specific example, that has nothing to do yet with his extended tuning system and all of that, is that he assigns very specific qualities to melodic intervals. First of all, there is a strict separation between melodic and harmonic intervals. There are two different categories of intervals, and they are structured in two different ways. And the more important ones for Vicentino are the melodic ones, and each melodic interval has, in a simplified way, one of two qualities, incitato or molle. These are structural qualities, not just emotional ones. And his counterpoint guidelines, they use these qualities. You can combine qualities of intervals that happen at the same time, so two voices moving independently. They can have both the quality incitato or both the quality of molle, or they can be mixed. And these are two different flavors of polyphony. And that's a way of looking at polyphony that I never saw in any other context, and I certainly never looked at music like that. So that's one specific example of how Vicentino is different in how he communicates about counterpoint and polyphony compared to other writers of the 16th century.
I'm interested in the fact that they're both, in their treatises, trying to teach people. Lusitano is trying to teach counterpoint, Vicentino is trying to teach a new method in a slightly different way. Could you tell us in a bit more detail what they are trying to teach, who they were intending to reach, what were they aiming at, and what did they hope could be produced as a result? Maybe the other way around this time.
Vicentino addresses the whole entire pipeline from conception to performance. That means composer, singer, instrumentalist, scholar even. Maybe that could be considered a listener, I don't know. And what he teaches is to have more tools available to express the meaning of text. So he comes from a point of quest for a larger palette of things, like more colors to paint with, for example. And he does that by assuming that you know what music is, like he's not talking to a beginner, but a musician, practical musician, who is already knowledgeable, but he adds more things to it. He extends the solmization, for example. He greatly enlarges the number of melodic intervals that are available. And he teaches how to sing them, the solmization, through solmization. He teaches the player how to play them on a specific instrument. Before that, he teaches how to build an instrument to represent the system. Then he describes how to read music, to notate and read music in that extended system. And of course he gives ideas how to use the features of the system to make text more expressive.
What results do you think he hopes to achieve? What do you think that he wanted people to create?
Overwhelmingly touching music, I believe.
Vicentinos Musica.
Well, the contents of the treatise are pretty much similar to many of the Musica pratticabile treatises that we find. So the first book is devoted to mensural notation, the second one is devoted to counterpoint, and the last one is devoted to chromatic genre. But where it stands out is really in the extent to what he fighted to document. He made an extraordinary effort in providing musical examples at so many levels. One main difference with other treatises is that, for instance, every technique that he wants to show, he gives a different example for every voice. So we have the same technique is applied to the cantus part, to the alto, to the tenor, and to the bass, for instance. And I do have some stats here that I found quite revealing. The bulk of the treatise is the second book, one dedicated to counterpoint. If I did the right counting, I think it contains as many as 244 counterpoint examples. Of them, the first chapter is devoted to counterpoint on cantus firmus with 119 examples. The second chapter is devoted to concerted counterpoint, which is a collective practice, which is very spectacular for many reasons, because you hear polyphony being improvised. But at the same time, it has some restrictions in comparison with the first method, which is one person business or show. There's only one person involved, producing one or more lines. Third and fourth chapters are devoted to very extremely difficult skills, either in the way of canons, all sort of fugas and canon, or in combination with a mensural melody. So at the end of the book, he substitutes the cantus firmus for a mensural melody that we probably have the chance to experiment a little bit with later. And only when he feels, this was idea was very well explained by Candilen in his article of 2011. Only when he feels that he's reaching the limit of what can be explained in written form, in a written book, only then he starts working a new chapter, working on composition. And he only gives very brief instructions, like how to begin a piece, how to end, how to make cadences. So very practical. Because for the rest, as he also says in the other part of the book, everything that can be done in composition can also be done in improvisation. So that's also an interesting point, where the limit is, or what is the first thing you think you associate counterpoint with, either with an improvised practice or with a written one.
I was interested that Johannes said earlier that Vicentino would not have said something was right or wrong. He was just trying to encourage a development in a certain direction. Lusitano gave so many examples. Did he have a view that it had to be like this, or was this to develop the skills that were then necessary that people could do other things as well. So was he making judgments about right and wrong? Or?
Yeah, I think he only stops here and there in a few places to show what doesn't really work, what should be avoided. But in general, all the thinking behind the examples is very positive in this sense. He's just showing what can be done. And there are many things that can be done.
Yeah, that's really a parallel. I also have a feeling there's a positive attitude in Vicentino's text, encouraging, try. He often calls the reader the studente ingenioso. So now I showed you something, go ahead, try, and come up with more. Just a tiny example when he introduces the ways you can go from a consonant, for example a third, to the unison. How do you do that in two parts? You move, one can stay and the other moves, or both move. And he gives 8 little examples of 2 and 2 notes. And then in the text he says, and you can do this with enharmonic intervals like the diesis as well. Go and play, without any written example about it.
What do you think was the primary motivation for them both in writing their treatises? What made them try to write this down, for one thing?
Well, artistically, in the case of Vicentino, I think the answer would be pretty clear. Just to produce music is a tool for producing music, which is the greatest thing a musician can do, right? Whether he provide or compose. But then, we consider other terms, like maybe he was also interested in having it published, as Giordano mentioned earlier. So it was a way of having a published treatise that could help with his career, probably. So it could be also this kind of motivation. But from the artistically point of view, I think the production of music, new music, would be the main motivation.
I think I would split the answer in his motivation for developing his, I never know how to call it, vision. It's not a system, it's not a theory, it's a practice, a vision for musical practice. I mentioned it's to increase the expressive power of polyphony. And very specifically, we heard already, this is a defensive treatise, because he was developing something probably quite secretly, also protecting the secret knowledge, and by being challenged by your hero, he was sort of provoked to be very clear about what he's doing and to give reasons and a full explanation. But having said that, this is also, in my point of view, is a momentary state of things. I'm sure he went on with these ideas that are not documented.
One reason I asked that was because the subjects that they're both trying to discuss in their treatises are really hard to write about. This is the kind of thing that you need to be a practical teacher, working with, Lusitano's case, a group of singers, Vicentino's case, certainly a keyboard player, but also a group of singers. And then it's kind of easy to put your ideas across. People hear what they're doing, and you learn physical things, and people learn what works and doesn't work in improvised counterpoint, particularly when more than one person is improvising at a time. And yet they're faced with the problem of writing this down on the page, and that is a real challenge for them. Could you talk a bit about the things that they were struggling with when they were trying to write this down?
Might be the moment to demonstrate a bit, for both of us. What do you think?
Maybe, yes.
I'll get out of the way.
Would you like to start, or shall I?
What we have is a few examples on the cantus part of Rombe, Mass on the Kyrie, and what I could try to show is in how many ways, well, only a few of them, because I have to say that one of the most common complaints of scholars, when even back then in the 16th and 17th century, is that most treatises were lacking musical examples, and the problem with Lusitano is rather the opposite. So when I had to choose an example, I really had a hard time deciding what to do. So what I decided to do is I would like to maybe show some of the techniques that he applied to a mensural melody, because I thought it would be more musical than working on a cantus firmus. And as part of this struggle to show everything that can be shown and can be done, maybe we can do a few examples of the techniques employed when trying to create a new part that works with a composed melody. In this case, in converse, the period. So maybe we can do that with the...
Yeah, maybe we have to describe what happened earlier today. Vicente came here assuming that there will be a musician, for example me, playing this melody for him, so that he can show the different counterpoints. And I said, yeah, sure, no problem, we just tried before. We tried, and it didn't work, because what I didn't expect is the complexity of what he's doing. So what I was going to play was pretty straightforward, but it's so intricate that I realized I would need weeks, if not months, to work on it to be able to play with him. And for me that totally made sense. I would never ask anyone to quickly sing an enharmonic melody by Vicentinos with all the pieces. Of course not, you have to train. And I was sort of pleased to have this experience that, yeah, you need to train these things. This is very, very high level stuff. Well, so the solution was either to have a playback audio file that you brought with you, or use this organ played from a computer, because the computer doesn't need to practice, which is the solution we have.
Especially the computer doesn't listen to me.
That's the key thing.
Sometimes it's very helpful. But I have to say that he did a great job.
Thank you.
So the complexity level here, or topic here, is only about rhythm, which is one of the many possible ways of...
Is about?
Rhythm, rhythmical complexity. So I can start by showing what would be a rather simple example and see how it develops. It's only a selection of them. So the first example would be adding meanings to the pre-existence Kyrie by Gonder. So this technique consists of choosing only one musical value. This is a kind of constraint, what he calls paso forzado. It's just a way of reducing possibilities to focusing on only one thing, which is one musical value, in this case, meanings.
There is a countdown one that this is just for Vicente to get the computer tempo, otherwise he would do that.
So this is the meaning. And this, maybe for the next couple of examples, we shorten them, although just to make more room for the.
I like it.
But there are so many of them. So, okay, the next iteration of the example, the one I played, is called 63A in Philip Cangelen's edition. Someone's curious. So the next one will be the next one, 63B. And the only difference with the previous one is that these meanings will be displaced by the half meaning. So they are continually syncopated. This is called. Yeah. It's fine.
By the way, the reference pitch on the organ is G flat dot. Which is the DS is lower than A. Sorry.
Syncopated meanings, but then shifted by semi-meaning rest. So then now things start getting a bit more complicated.
This is when I dropped out. You just show me when.
Okay.
I just stop.
Okay. So, same meaning. So last example I want to show is same thing. We have semi-minutes, syncopated semi-minutes, started with rest now. Okay. This is part of the Renaissance music soundscape that otherwise would just be, we could be maybe aware of in passing, like within a theoretical text. But the great advantage of having musical examples is that you can really have a very clear idea of what it means in practice, how it sounded like, etc. And of course, it's a great training method for whoever wanting to learn improvised counterpoint, because this is very comprehensive and very exhaustive and very well, well graduated. I mean, it's very progressive, as shown by the examples. Right?
Doing these things, does it change your view on normal music?
That's a great question. Also because I think it's very important to reflect on what the context of these kind of examples. You can be tempted very easily to call them merely exercises. But I think this is a whole entirely new debate and something to reflect on, because it would be a very logical way, and in a way they are exercises, they are musical examples. So where the line is between the two is very difficult to say in principle. I think in this very aspect, it's very useful to look at some testimonies. For instance, Zacconi, we were talking earlier. Zacconi talks about something we could call the counterpoint challenge, which involved many singers challenging each other and doing these kind of skills, very difficult skills. And so where the exercise ends and the music begins, or vice versa, that's also quite interesting thing to reflect on. But I will not just think of them as merely exercises, or not all of them. What I did now, the examples I show are rather mechanical, but there are also many examples that deal with how to make a graceful counterpoint. So with style, musical style. I could maybe show one later, but they deal with very important or very common concepts like grace, aire, buon aire, what makes something interesting musically, rather than just a method or exercise.
Is it interesting. Also, Vicentino uses that expression of bellaria, which happens when the qualities of the melodic intervals are in sync. And if they're out of sync, it's a composizione confusa, which is also okay, but for text that is inviting that kind of state. You asked about the challenges to write things down. I think that is where we departed on that little trick. I think I can show it in a similar way on the archiorgano, because this instrument is sort of one of the way outs from this challenge that Vicentino faced. He couldn't really rely on any verbal or theoretical language to transmit what he was doing. A very simple example are note names. So if I have a very clear concept of thinking in 16th century terms of these notes. It's a natural gamut. There are different modes and all of those structuring features, but basically we have a gamut can be projected on the hand with syllables, relative hexachords. That's a very reliable system, a very complex system already. But what happens if I have this as a first note, of a mode, of a scale, however you want to call it? What happens here? All the stuff in between, how do we call those? Even today we struggle, we could call them, if I call this a G and this an A, it could be G sharp and A flat. I have two names to use, but there are more than that. What is in between? We don't have note names, not even today. We could make up something, but it's not evident how to come from the natural gamut to all these degrees in between. And there are musical material. It's not just a random inflection of stable notes. There are actually voice leading intervals, and they can be used in counterpoint mechanics. For example, I could have a minor third. Now I have to, I'm already in a different mode of playing a minor third and a major third. I go from the minor third to the major third in contrary motion. The lower voice goes down, a small interval. The upper voice goes up, a small interval. This is counterpoint. Impossible in the natural gamut. Just not there. Vicentino does that all the time in enharmonic pieces. But how to name these intervals? He couldn't, we still can't. So he introduced extended solmization by defining the natural gamut as the first hand and then 7 more hands in different subdivisions. So you can actually solmize this. And assign syllables to all the degrees in between, making them accessible, touchable intervals and notes. He uses or abuses the normal notation system with 5 lines and note heads by supercharging the meaning of alteration signs and introducing a new sign, a dot above the note. With that he can sort of describe locations of notes, but not necessarily in their meaning. For example, this sound looks strange in his notation. You wouldn't see what's happening. You first have to read and translate the intervals into your own mental system and then understand, oh, it's a minor third going to a major third, both consonant, both voices doing the same interval in contrary motion. This is all sort of something you need to know about, and then you can read the notation. And he proposes a keyboard that makes all these pitches available to the touch, to the fingers, and of course also for reference. He introduces a sort of a coordinate system of rows, and by that we are going to talk about this tomorrow morning. He can describe the location of a specific key independent of the tuning system. And with all of that together, he manages to navigate this pitch space. Thank you for keeping me going. Just realizing.
No, you're going to carry on.
So that's one way out of this challenge, that actually he didn't have the means to communicate. He needed to create them and introduce and explain these techniques as part of his treatise. And only after you process them, you learned them, and you internalize them, you can actually read what he's trying to tell you. So it's a strongly practical book. It's not a book about theory. He doesn't give a theory, actually. He tells you how to navigate the space, but the space itself you have to translate into a mental image, and then you can make music with it. So that's just a confirmation of what Anne and Martin said already. He's not a theorist. He's a practical musician. He did something, and he tried to find means to communicate it and to communicate about it. And the book is that, in my perspective. For me, it was very helpful to have this book, to get access to this whole space. But to explore the space, I have to do it myself. The book doesn't do it for me. I think that was a very long answer to that question.
No, that's good. That actually gives rise to the last question, I think, that would be interesting to hear from both of you about, which is that you kind of said it already, Johannes. Suppose someone who was very, very good at 16th century Italian had this book. Would that be enough to teach them what Vicentino is trying to teach them? Do we need to look at it in a different way today? Do we need to bring in other theories from outside, or different ways of thinking about it to achieve that? Similarly, if you gave someone Vicentino's treatise, would they be able to learn today how to do improvised counterpoint? I can see that you've been learning quite well. But do we need more? Do we need to be thinking about it in other ways as well, bringing in ideas from elsewhere, other people's practices?
Yeah. I think that there's more material than we can certainly achieve today, even after very hard work. And we are very far away today to being able to reproduce most of the examples in the book. We are still having a hard time with the basics, like not making basic interval mistakes. Part of the reason is also, I believe, because of our musical education, which I think is a little too much based on reading rather than listening. We are called readers, we classical musicians, even specialized early music players. We always work with music score, and I'd like to make a parallel with colors, with vision. For instance, I just wait for the day in which we musicians can differentiate two different intervals, like a fifth or a sixth or whatever, as clearly and as quickly as when we face two different colors, like red and orange, which is absolutely immediate reaction. We still don't have so much that within the classical music education, I believe. Although we are all able to distinguish them, but when it comes to improvising, it requires another level of automatization of this instantaneous reaction to that we still have to develop.
So reading is not enough.
Certainly not. Certainly not. And you can demonstrate it because everything perhaps has been written about us, the session and whatever. And at the end, we can know many but you are still unable to improvise. So it really requires a practical work and approach.
Would it be correct to say it requires a human mind for it to make sense? It's a philosophical thing. Like Vicentino requires an organ to make clear what he's talking about. But Musitano,
sharp mind and sharp ears. Yeah, because some of the, I was just doing a two-part demonstration, but imagine being able to produce extemporary four-part music out of a computer films, by which you sing one part while Sagnar moved by the hand another with a group of singers, and that was done by, for instance, they knew very well the penchant melodies, but they were also doing very extreme things like turning a book upside down, so you get a completely different melody that you have to react to. Something I find very curious is that, for us, this certainly looks very extreme, but it was common knowledge somehow at the time, because all chapel ministers, many chapel ministers were tweaked to these kind of exercises when they were applying for a position.
And if we look at publications like the Ippolito Camatore di Negri, probably some of the results that they achieved were remarkable. Yeah. He published he wrote down the results of some of the improvisations that they did.
Yeah. We have a very interesting quotation also by Bermudo, who says that he was listening to some singers and he said they were doing so great, so fantastic music that if you were to write it down, it would be a fantastic composition. So it's a contemporary.
Johannes, you just said that to understand Vicentino you need an organ. We all have one, please.
I want it.
Yeah. There must be another way.
It's tempting to translate what is written in Vicentino's treatise and what Jorgen is doing into sort of modern day theories. One of the most obvious one is the equal division of the octave into 31 parts. And that I observe a tendency in the 20th century research and literature about Vicentino that the first thing you do is translate whatever you find into such a mathematical model, namely 31 equal, and then you think within that. And I think you miss a great deal of information by doing that, because it's just a model that is not wrong. Like these pitches, the frequencies you can predict based on 31 equal are very similar to the ones that the organ produces, but it's much more to it than a specific system that he describes. And I think this morning I had such an experience when we rehearsed with those artists for the concert tonight. I don't want to give away too many things that we are going to present tonight, but the practice of doing these enharmonic things in pieces, they imprint your hearing and your singing, and it's still present also if you're not doing it anymore. There's a shadow of enharmonics and chromaticisms in normal music. And I'm very curious, this morning I experienced it very strongly within music of Vicentino, but I'm very curious to now listen and perform other composers who are not chromatic or enharmonic and search for this. And for me that's an aspect of communicating about music that is way beyond what you can write with language. So you do something and it changes you and your own perception of music. And with that change, you go on as a musician. It's a pretty remarkable thing. And I'm very convinced that it's part of this Vicentino world. You have to do it and you will be changed by it, and then you do with it what you want. But it's a very strong thing that he offers. And I think it's similar for maybe I'm heading towards a final statement. I suspect it's similar with Musicano.
Yeah.
It changes you as a musician just by having these skills.
Yeah, yeah, and improvisation is just in general. Yeah, certainly there's no, I always say there's no way back. Once you, once you start doing that in public performances and you feel and you experience the difference between, because you are using different parts of your brain that you don't use if you just read a music score. Because the music score tells you what to play, which notes are you supposed to play, and improvise, of course, it's very obvious, but it's your brain who has to come up with the notes that you have to play, so you have to be more active somehow in other areas. And it definitely changes. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you both for all the insights you've given us and some surprising parallels between Musicano and Vicentino. Who gets the scoop?
I'm looking at the clock and I see that we've got about 1 minute.
We started 10 minutes late.
Just saying, but dinner doesn't wait. And so, but I would like to maybe make the opportunity to have 1 or 2 questions asked that need to be asked at the moment. Anne Smith.
It's not a question, but I've had exactly the same experience with solmization. It's written about, but nobody ever really went into it. And I think it's a very important thing that essentially all of the basic elements that were used for composition, like partimento, are things that have been completely ignored in the study of the performance practice of early music because they weren't in the big theorist books like Sarlino or whoever. And that these are actually far more important as practices than all of the rules that we see written there, because they actually inform the very basis of what we do.
Thanks, and I'm really glad that you mentioned how much it changed your perspective on the music, on normal music, as Johannes said, because I felt it happening to me as well. It happens every time that my mind starts to melt a little bit. And it really gives me a new perspective on everything I hear. Any other final comments or questions before we go to break? Florian Vogt.
Just a short question. I was wondering, do we have any information how people back then worked with the 2 books? How people back then worked with these 2 books? This was, you shared your information today, as we approach the books from our today perspective. I was just wondering, do we have there any information how they work with these materials?
I think I skipped my answer because there is a talk tomorrow about this, more or less, like readers of Vicentinos. But
yeah, in the case of Musicano, it was a private owned manuscript, but we can imagine that all teachers, all the musicians have their own paper method. So Musicano just happened to bind everything together, and we were extremely fortunate that this survived. That answers the question.
Sure.
Yes. Very good. I'll close the session on this with a great big thank you to David Gallagher, Johannes Keller, and Vicente Faria. Conference speakers begins at 6 o'clock. If you don't know where you're going and you're invited, please tag along with one of us who knows the way. And for everyone else, we're looking forward to seeing you back here at 8:30 for the concert with Domus Matis.